Let's talk about some of the nuts and bolts of Rome. The traditional date for, or at least the legendary date for the founding of the city of Rome, goes back to Romulus and Remus. Romulus was a descendant of a Trojan warrior named Aeneas, and Romulus, according to legend, killed his brother Remus, founded a city on 7 hills, which will become Rome. In the beginning, Rome was ruled over by kings until it will eventually be conquered by another group of people living on the Italian peninsula, the Etruscans. The, uh, the establishment of the Roman Republic goes back to when you look at really the Italian peninsula here, you can see that there are more than just the Latin speakers who will become the inhabitants of Rome. There are Greeks in the south, there are the Etruscans up here, which we'll talk about. So Rome is actually a bigger place. People came into Italy because the Alps, the mountain chain to the north, there are seas. Italy is a peninsula, so there are seas on 3 sides. There is, when you go back and look at it here, so you're kind of surrounded by water. You have a major mountain chain up here with the Alps. But once you got onto the peninsula, it was a Mediterranean climate, good soil, good climate, good for farming. And so when people got there, they actually sort of liked to stay there. So once people got onto the Italian peninsula, they tended to stay there. The city of Rome will grow up around these 7 hills and eventually become a major city. But when you sort of look at Rome in the bigger picture here, you got to understand that even though the Latin speakers, the Romans, are starting to develop here, remember the Etruscans are up here, the Greeks are down here, they're not alone. And the Romans are actually going to be big borrowers. They're going to borrow from really everyone around them. The Up here you have the Gauls, a Celtic group that will be a major enemy of Rome. The Down here you have Carthage, which is a Phoenician colony that had continued to develop and later becomes really a major trading empire. Carthage is actually trying to move out here onto the island of Sicily. And so don't think that the Latin speakers that become the Romans, when they move here on the peninsula, that they are all by themselves and that they're the only people there, because they're not. The Romans will eventually be conquered by and become part of the Etruscan world. The Etruscans who settle in what is today the Tuscany region of Italy, they're a mysterious group. We don't really know who they are. Some people think that they are migrants onto the Italian peninsula. Others believe that they were the indigenous people that first got there. But they will eventually take control of the Roman world and eventually become enemies of the Romans. Now, the Romans borrow tremendously from the Etruscans. Some scholars believe that they borrowed the arch from the Etruscans, that they learned how to build very complicated things like drainage works, sewer works for the cities, and may have even learned about the phalanx from the Etruscans. But they also learned, the Romans also learned that they did not like being ruled over by kings. And they are going to eventually boot the Etruscans out. The Romans will by about 509 BC, the Romans will have had enough of the Etruscans and will overthrow the Etruscan kings. And when they do, Rome kind of moves into this new phase, the first real phase of Roman independence, the first 500 years or so of Roman history, is the Republic phase. And it essentially goes from 509 BC until 31 BC, when the Roman Empire will begin. Most people, when they hear Rome, they think of the Roman Empire, but the first 500 years of Roman history is the Republic phase. And that's what we'll have to deal with right now. Okay. The chapter also spends a little bit of time talking about really the development of these two groups. When you see the Roman Republic begin to be founded in 509 BC, there are really two major groups to society: the patricians and the plebeians. Patricians are landowners, many of whom trace their origins back to some of the founding families of Rome. They will be the most important families in Rome, and they will eventually become part of at least 100 families will become part of the important republican body known as the Senate. Plebeians are not landowners. They own no land. They can be very wealthy, and no matter how much wealth you have as a plebeian, you're still not a patrician. So these classes are rigid and inflexible. Plebeians do not own land, patricians do. Okay? Wealth has nothing to do with it. It's all about land ownership. As a result, the plebeians are not going to have a whole lot of say in government. And what you end up with is similar to what we talked about with the Greeks. You end up with a growing divide between the wealthy and the unwealthy, between the haves and the have-nots. And eventually, the plebeians are going to want more of a say in the government. And when they do, we have a little bit of an issue that we'll have to deal with in a little bit. The the other thing that the chapter deals with right about now is early Roman religion. The Roman gods will evolve from several different areas, but especially from the ideas of the Greeks. The early Roman religion is polytheistic. The the idea is many of these gods are going to, just as we saw with so many other of these early religions, it's about nature. They represent parts of nature. The Many of the Roman people will be dutiful. They will participate in religions and rituals, and they will observe animals. But eventually, really, some of these gods, borrowing from the Etruscans and borrowing from the Greeks, the Romans will end up kind of taking the Greek system and making it into a Roman system. Zeus, for example, becomes Jupiter. And you start seeing the same things that we saw in Greece, where you have human gods or human looking gods that have extraordinary powers. All right. So essentially, what happens is the Romans Romanize the Greek system, and they make the Roman system a really a copy of the Greek system. They'll build temples, they will have religious observations, they will have a high priest, they will worship in the home, they will worship in the cities, and so they borrow pretty extensively from the Greeks. The Oftentimes these Roman gods are stern, they are of course very powerful, but there is really no sort of formal priesthood. The Also, by the way, as Rome will eventually expand, they will come into and be exposed to some of the same things that the Greeks were, different religious ideas that they will either accept and incorporate or reject. The Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, which is really Zeus, Hera, and Athena in the Greek system, are really the central gods, and we interact with the gods. They're supposed to protect us, provide for us, but we are supposed to be pious, virtuous, and make sure that we go and do the things they want us to do. Many households had shrines to the various Roman gods as well. The uh, the Roman family was very much centered around the male. The uh, the male head of household is the most important. Marriage is private, but usually involved a dowry, and divorce was pretty common. Okay, it wasn't anything really special. Roman children were educated in the homes by the parents. Boys oftentimes prepared for military life, girls learning how to run a household, and Roman women were supposed to be modest and obedient and bear children. The uh, the most important or the most honored Roman women were the six Vestal virgins, who were really the only women who had any sort of freedom. Everything else, though, every other women or every all the other women in Rome were pretty much subordinate to male authority. The uh, the father assumed really a tremendous amount of power. Roman fathers oftentimes talked with other fathers about rules and about things they should be doing. So essentially, you have women being subservient to men, which is some of the same things that we have talked about in some of the other areas. Okay. The poor women, of course, had very little say. All right. But women usually, of course, in the household, did much of the work. They provided the meals. They did the really the things that we would expect all of the women who don't have any political power, any social power to have to do. The children, of course, were schooled formally if especially they were being, especially aristocratic children were being groomed for military and political service. So usually the Roman education involved things like teaching about rhetoric, the art of public speaking. So the girls, of course, received not formal education, but especially education about running the household. And oration and rhetoric, of course, very important for boys who were moving into politics. In class, we're going to talk a lot about the development of Roman government, but it's important to kind of understand what the Romans were like before we get into this. So make sure that you pay attention to this, and we'll remember this as we go about the creation of the Roman government. All right.